Hello, I'm Sam Gerrans. Today is Monday, 6th of May, 2024, and today I'm going to be discussing my view of the war in Ukraine vis-a-vis larger spiritual questions. Okay, today I'm going to be discussing the war in Ukraine as I see it, and also sharing some books that I've read that I recommend. And the reason why I'm going to do this, a couple of reasons. The first one is I'm in the middle of writing a long essay, which really, I think, answers the questions about the QUR'AN vis-a-vis previous scriptures. And I'm not ready to release it. It's too long and it's going to take a while to finish. But in the meantime, I did want to make a video because I'm asked a lot about this, because I live in Russia and have a background here, etc. And so I just wanted to sort of share my thoughts. I come at this at a slightly different angle. You see, what I see is that there are two basic narratives. One is that the West is this evil thing, and that Russia is, relatively speaking, better. Or the inverse of this, evil Putin, righteous, wonderful West. So that's how it's presented, depending on which side of the line you come. I have to say that I understand why Russia's fighting this war. I see that it's in a very limited way. If we're going to take a limited view of history, it's on the right side of history, if you want to call it that. But my view is a bit more nuanced than this. So I'm just going to kind of get into it in general terms. Now, the first thing is we find a lot of people who talk about, there's the emergence of BRICS and the so-called, what do they call it, the multipolar world and so on. This is an unalloyed good, obviously a good thing. I suppose you get people who come from a more of an American patriotic point of view. They're trying to reinstitute or resurrect the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Essentially, people trying to get back to a better past. This is often connected with the idea that when enough people wake up, things are all going to get better. I don't agree with any of this. In my view, from what I see, most people are stupid, or effectively so, if not, technically so. And from my point of view, this is a normal and natural progression or characteristic of where we're living, which, in my view, since that's what we're discussing, is we're living in a time of essential kind of collapse. Now, I know that we all have iPhones today, and we're supposed to be so kind of advanced, but in my view, seen from the point of view of medieval man or man of late antiquity, we are in civilizational freefall. Now, what I want to do is share a couple of books. I'm just going to go through and I'm not going to discuss them in any great length, but if you are a reader and you would like to dig into some things which will put some meat on what I'm talking about, this is the first book that I recommend. I've mentioned it before, Reign of Quantity and Signs of the Times by Rene G. Absolutely recommend that book. He will place a lot of this in perspective and understand that what we're really living through is a collapse of quality. And this is implicit in the whole democratic idea that human beings are essentially fungible, that there's no difference between any of us, and your opinion, my opinion, it's just an opinion, you see. Because this is how we've been trained. Maybe it's true. I don't know. I don't personally believe it is. And what's a fact is that men didn't believe this in the past. So if you want to get into why we're collapsing and how precisely, then I would recommend this, The Crisis of the Modern World by Rene G. So that deals with him. Rene G. was a French metaphysician, I would say. I think he was born in the around 1880, died, I think, in 1952. A very brilliant man, in my view. I don't agree with everything he says. He writes in a rather tedious, abstruse, technical manner, but if you can see past that, he's definitely worth the read. Now, I'm going to get into the next person. Now, I've talked about this man at length. Another Frenchman, Jac Elul, and I would absolutely recommend reading The Technological Society and Propaganda, Formation of Men's Attitudes. The reason why is what he describes in there. Now, I'm rather going to kind of fill out and get back to the whole Ukraine thing, fill out what he says. Essentially, he says that there are 4 basic postulates to what he calls technique. By technique, I guess you could say it's really modernity. And modernity in a form of pragmatic rapaciousness. That there are 4 basic tenets to this. So the first is that man is essentially good. This is a completely new idea, but this is it might not sound like a big idea to you, but this is the basis of humanism and everything which comes from that. The second is that man is born essentially to enjoy himself. Now, if you are from a sort of lower class family, that would be called fun or having a good time. If you come from a middle or upper middle class family, as do I, it's called interesting. Oh, that must be so interesting. It's the same thing, just different terminology. The whole point of it is that it's diversion. That's what you're here for. You're here for your own amusement. That's the point of it. Now, the ancients didn't believe this either. They believed that you were here to serve God or whatever it was, but they didn't believe that. The third is progress. And progress is in absolutely everything. The idea of progress as a technical solution. And then the fourth is that we live in a in a mechanistic universe. And from these 2 ideas, you get, they might not sound like big ideas to you, but from this, you get the whole transhumanist idea that man can be essentially reverse engineered. And I'm just sort of laying out to you the sort of the kind of the outline of where things are. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this is going back to the Ukraine war and so on, is the idea is that there is some sort of essential conflict, ideological conflict between Russia on the one hand and the West on the other. And this is completely untrue. Just as there was no essential conflict between capitalism and communism, they believe in all the same things, the things that I've just listed. So any apparent contrast between them is just that. It's an apparent contrast. The real contrast is not between left and right or east and west or any of these things, because everywhere's the West now. Everybody just wants an iPhone and so on. The real contrast is between what you might call the traditional society and what Elul calls technique. That's the actual contrast. And to summarize Elul, what he says, and I agree with him, is that any society which does not embrace technique, and technique is really the implementation of what those 4 postulates I just described, will be destroyed by those societies which do embrace them. And what he doesn't say, but which is implicit in his work, is that those societies which do embrace technique will be destroyed by technique itself, which brings me to the next person I recommend, which is Ted Kasinski, otherwise known as the Unabomber. Unfortunately, Ted Kasinski was active a bit too early. I think he just would have made a phenomenal blogger, but he didn't have that opportunity when he was alive. So the first one's called Technological Slavery and the Anti-Tech Revolution, How and Why. I don't agree with everything that Ted Kasinski says. You may see him as a Luddite on steroids, but he has a very good insight into the underlying problems, and more importantly, from my point of view, he rather brilliantly identifies what the underlying problem is with those people which I rather disparagingly called libtards, and who are really the foot soldiers for what you might call the New World Order. So anyway, going back to the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine, again, I stand with Russia on this, absolutely, and its right to defend itself and so on, if we're going to take it within a certain bandwidth. But seen from a broader perspective, really what they are is it's an industrial war, and what both sides are fighting for is the opportunity to maintain some sort of primacy in terms of technique. So the difference, but the ultimate difference between Russia and Europe and America and so on, is just the difference between. It's not even the difference between Shiaism and Sunniism. It's more like the difference between two different factions of Shiaism or Sunnism or Catholicism, if you like. They agree on all of the basics. And you see it as somebody who lives in Russia and has spent, I think, 23, 24 out of the last 30 years here. I've seen Russia go from what it was in the 1990. I first came to Russia in 1990 to where we are today. The entire civil society has been sterilized, essentially. When I first came here, people were really, really interesting. And there were many real characters. Now not everybody, but people they just want what you want. They just want stuff. They just want more for them. What I'm saying is that the actual culture here, no matter how you dress it up with various overlays of, the Russian Ruskaya dusha and all of this stuff, the great Russian soul. These are just sort of almost like tourist attractions, cultural tourism. Russia is just like where you live. It has the same internet. People listen to the same nonsense. We have the same green-haired, delusional, movements and all of that. It's a little bit behind, if you can call it that. It still has some residual characteristics that you might associate with a normal society, thankfully. But those are dissipating, and it's nothing to do with war. It's something else. And trying to create trying to overlay some sort of propagandistic solution to this problem, it won't change the fundamentals. Anyway, I'll get on to the last few books. This next one is Imperium. Don't know if you can see that, by Francis P. Yoki, Yockey. He was a very bright guy. Apparently wrote this in about 6 months in Ireland. I think a few years after the Second World War, he participated in the Nuremberg trials as a lawyer and saw what a farce all of that was. And because he had a very good education and was able to think, which is something very few of us have anymore, is he was able to sort of place this within a broader context. And it's definitely worth a read. But to kind of cut to the chase, as they say, he rather sees that the Europe would eventually embrace again a conservative, what you might even call right-wing or far right-wing, but not in the sense that the Guardian newspaper uses the term ideology, as a final resurgence and attempt to free itself from the octopus-like stranglehold that it's been under since the Second World War, because Europe and America lost the Second World War. They were defeated by the interests that they were serving, and have certainly the men who laid down their lives during those wars have been, their cultures and countries have been destroyed now, and at their own expense, of course. But what I would say is that, and again, I'm going to try to relate this to Ukraine, we see this to some extent with the rise of, obviously at, the CIA certainly behind all of this, of right sector and what's it called, the Azov battalions and, very far right, Hitlerite type of movements within Ukraine. So you could say, well, in a way that Yoki's correct, this is what's happening. I would say that I can certainly see this happening, but you may be certain that the same people will be directing those movements who have been directing all of the libtard woke stuff that you've had before. So there's that. And what I see with the, going back to Ukraine, with these neo-Nazi movements within Ukraine, is that they are cartoonish. There isn't an intellectual background behind it. Their understanding of these things is simply that, it's cartoonish. So it's a mimicry or parody of a conservative position. And that itself, I would see as a characteristic of an involuting, of a collapsing society or civilization more broadly. So that's that. I also think that they're being used because quite clearly what's happening in Ukraine is genocide. It's a genocide. The West has put Russia in a position where Russia is going to carry on doing what it's doing as long as the West keeps throwing Ukrainians at this wall of death. I would call that genocide. There isn't any other word for it. Clearly, the usual people are getting rich from this, so there's that. But also, I see it as a process of land clearance. It's become common parlance to talk about Ukrainians in terms of fighting to the last Ukrainian. Well, that's correct. So what happens when there are no Ukrainians left? Well, it seems to me that a certain country in the Middle East that's made itself exceptionally unpopular and is also guilty of genocide is going to be needing somewhere to move to. And there's going to be all this prime farmland with nobody in it, sitting on the last remaining gas pipelines coming from Russia, from which they've got an automatic income. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I clearly, to me, on a sort of a very low level, it's obvious that is being part of the plan. Anyway, let's move on to the next one. My interest, just to say, is not political in this sense. The type of movements which we see happen, to my mind, are simply expressions of the collapse of tradition and the worship of self, which is what humanism is, and of which, if we're going to take Zionism, which I just alluded to, is the most extreme case of, because that is essentially what I suppose what Judaism has become, is a worship of the Jewish people, and humanism is just a generalized, sort of more profane version of the same thing for non-Jews. So it's not that anybody's any worse than anybody else. Anyway, let's just get into the last few of these. Yes, Julius Evola, this book, don't know if you can see it, I hope you can. Revolt Against the Modern World. Evola was associated with, and to some extent a disciple of, to some extent, although he exercised and maintained his own independent views from Guénon. But I would certainly recommend this. If you read Revolt Against the Modern World by Evola and Crisis of the Modern World by Guénon, you will see inverted the version of history that you've been taught, which is the version we're taught, which is we started off from nothing, amoeba, and now we're progressing, remember that word from Elul, to the apogee, the sort of zenith of progress, which is you with an iPhone walking around a shopping centre, dazed out of your mind. That's not what the ancients believed. They believed in the exact inverse of that, which we began in a golden age and we've sunk down to where we are now, rolling in detritus. So you'll get that from Evola, but explained extremely exactly. Another book that I recommend by Evola is this book here, Men Among the Ruins. And the point of this book is, as you live through these sorts of events, and going back to Ukraine, which if it wraps up at any point, they'll go on to the next thing and the next thing until eventually, they reach their cull. Because just briefly, the whole point of, as I've been saying for some years, the wokeism and all of this doesn't end well. This ends in the killing fields. Socialism in all of its manifestations always does. Marxism always does, because it needs someone to blame for the failures of its ideology. And it's always your fault. That's the one constant. It's always your fault. It doesn't matter what the question is. It's you. You're an ist, an it, or an ob. And if only you weren't, what they've dreamt up would work. But you're the problem, and it doesn't matter where you are. That's true in North Korea. It's true in these academic killing fields in Europe and America now called universities. It's always somebody else's fault, your fault, to be precise. Now, the reason why Men Among the Ruins is worth a read is because it was always understood historically that exceptional men were few and far between, and that the people that I've listed to you so far would have understood that. And I think I have something of an exceptional, I'm not being nice to you or anything, but it is true. I have my audience on this channel, this is not the sort of standard audience. And so I'm operating in expectation that there are going to be people who can read this and will benefit from it. The idea being that as things get worse, and that's all that is going to happen. There isn't going to be this, big awakening moment, and Jim Bob and his family of, lard-bellied morons are going to suddenly turn into, conscientious and sacrificial people fighting a war against evil. No, it's never going to happen. Okay, it's not ever. And why would you think that would happen? The actual reality is that men of understanding are going to become fewer and fewer and fewer. And so you need a level of sort of fortification. I mean, I'm talking beyond scripture, in order to stand, to basically not to go nuts. So Men Among the Ruins is a good one. So as we're going through this sort of collapse in Ukraine, and stop looking. I don't know if you pertain to this sort of background, but lots of people are waiting for the emergence of the multipolar world, like that's going to be different. No, what you're witnessing is the emergence of the new world order. It's this what you're living through. What I'm trying to explain is, despite the fact that I absolutely agree that Russia is on the right side of history, seen from quite a myopic point of view, the broader fact is that what we're witnessing is the emergence of a new world order. And people who, 20, 30 years ago would have understood this to be something terrible are now embracing it and saying, wonderful. It's never going to get any better. And my advice would be, don't expect it to, and you won't be disappointed. All you can do is to educate yourself and to maintain some sort of equilibrium in the civilization as it collapses, which it can only do. And if you read the books I've just listed to, you'll understand that. Anyway, Men Among the Ruins is a good one. Another good one I would say is worth a read is this, Spengler, Oswald Spengler's Hour of Decision. Now, Spengler wrote famously The Decline of the West, which is a rather sprawling and, frankly, an education in itself to read. But The Hour of Decision is a much better sort of summary, I would say, and much more accessible to those of us who don't have fine arts degrees, etc. Last two books, okay, and then we'll wrap this up. Another Evola book, Ride the Tiger. Here we are, Ride the Tiger. A survival manual for the aristocrats of the soul. I've read this a couple of times, and in fact, 3 times. I was right in books when I read them and where I was, and it's helpful. Again, I suppose it is an adjunct to the Men Among the Ruins, understanding the time that you're living in and not looking to others for support or understanding or likes or followers or views or whatever it is that people think give them validity. It doesn't work that way. If you are possessed of a soul which understands value as opposed to volume, then I recommend this book. And the last one is, and this is a man that I've started reading recently. I found him a little bit challenging for a while, but I would include him to some extent, is Fridtjof Schuon. I've read a few books of his. This one is called To Have a Center. Don't know if you can see that. Definitely worth a read. He will have been influenced by some of the same movements as those that I'm talking about here. An intellectual, but not in the trading in ideas sense. I mean somebody who actually has an intellection, an understanding, a comprehension of the things that he's talking about, an experience of them, and he's able to explain them reasonably accessible way. Anyway, I don't think that there are any real sides in what we're talking about. Going back to the whole Ukraine thing, not because there aren't vested interests on both sides of it, but because essentially all sides are committed to the same thing, which is Elul's notion of technique. If you look at the war in Ukraine, this isn't a warrior war. This isn't about personal or individual heroism. That's not what is winning wars or winning this war. It's an industrial war. It's an output war. It's everything that is encapsulated in industrial production, means of production, and logistics. That's what wins the wars. It's an industrial plebeian democide. And if you want my view on it with regards to Ukraine, essentially what the Ukrainian government is doing is selling its population as cannon fodder for money, after which the land will be handed over to BlackRock, whatever's left of it, and occupied by whoever can claim to be the biggest victims. These are manifestations. These are of a collapsing society, as seen historically, as seen from the big picture, not from what you're hearing today on the news, but in the eyes of men who still had some semblance of a grasp on the much broader realities, and who understood that it doesn't matter whether the masses wake up or not. They were too bright to wait for things like that. Anyway, I wanted to share those thoughts. I'm in the middle of writing a long, extended piece, which I think addresses most of what I want to say about the Quran vis-a-vis previous scriptures, but I'm not ready to release it yet. But I wanted to make a video that is more current, but also for those people who can still read and wanted to know, and I get asked a lot, about books. I just wanted to sort of hit these main books, which I would say I would absolutely recommend, and pretty much in the order that I've listed them here for those who are interested. Anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.